All right. Welcome everyone here on the internet watching our QMS Boot Camp. So I'm Kyle Chambers, CEO, founder of Texas Quality Assurance. And again, I am going to reiterate what the QMS Boot Camp is and why we're doing it and how you can go about accessing it. So QMS Boot Camp is a course that we designed over the years. Truthfully, this goes all the way back to my earliest days in the QHSE world, because I needed to teach some of these ideas to the leadership team, to the engineering team, to the management team. And so QMS Bootcamp is a culmination of really 10 years of work towards that goal. So QMS Bootcamp is the course for your leadership team, your quality management team, management, to really understand and learn the skills necessary to develop, implement, and maintain a QMS. So here for the foreseeable future, we will be going through on a weekly basis with a session at a time of the QMS Bootcamp. This is normally a 4-day course, but we are giving you a condensed version here online that we are putting out absolutely for free. And the reason we're putting out for free is because we know that in these crazy times, folks need as many tools as they have to succeed. And we truly believe in the value that quality management and quality assurance programs can provide to small businesses. And so we're super excited to get this information out to you so that you can use it in your team to just make the best use of the tools and resources that you have available. Today's episode of QMS Bootcamp, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking a lot about process mapping. Now, we're going to condense this a little bit because, as some of you might know, last week we had some technical errors. You might notice there's a little bit better audio and video than we have had on some of the previous videos, but there was a bit of a learning curve to get there. So this week things were working great. So we're going to jump right in to the boot camp here today. So talking about process approach, we will talk about process approach so much it is not even funny because it is so incredibly important. This morning we're recording some episodes for the Quality Matters podcast, which if you have not subscribed, go on to whatever device you listen to podcasts on and be certain you download Quality Matters, you subscribe to it. Episodes are 20 minutes long, great content. So be sure to check that out. But we talk about process approach all the time. And the idea of process approach is that it involves a systematic, kind of a look at the management system. How are each piece of the system interconnected? So this is a much deeper dive and a very different dive than looking at things simply at face value, than simply looking at things at the value of the level of document control. We really want to dig in and understand how these various pieces interact and really what builds our system. Because that's what a system is, after all. A system is interconnected processes. So we have to be approaching everything from a process approach. I've probably mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again. And there's actually a link here on our YouTube channel for what I call coffee pot process mapping. So definitely encourage you to check that out as kind of additional content to this video here. But there's some keys with the process approach that we really need to think about. The first thing is it all begins with a quality policy. Now, if you're saying, Kyle, I'm doing a health and safety system over here, I'm doing an environmental system over here, or Kyle, we're working with ASME and we're going for our R&U stamps, why are you talking quality policy? Well, let's think about quality as, let's put some quotes around it, a quality policy, whether it's a quality policy for your QA program, a quality policy for your HSE program, whatever it is, we have to have that quality policy. That quality policy has to be in alignment with the values and mission of your organization. In the podcast, we've actually talked about other case studies where each department wrote their own individual policy that was in alignment with the company policy. This stuff's really important. It is so much more than just lip service that we give for compliance to the standard. If integrated into the work you do, it makes a huge difference in the long-term success of your team. So when we talk about, management of processes, kind of the management of the system as a whole, We achieve this through what is known as the PDCA cycle. We've talked about this before. We're talking about it today, and we'll talk about it in the future. But the PDCA cycle is plan, do, check, act. Seems fairly fundamental, fairly straightforward. But unlike those fundamental things where you think about it once when you're learning it and then you move on and never touch it again, this isn't like riding a bike. See, every time you ride a bike, you're just kind of following patterns that you've learned before. But when it comes to process mapping and a process approach, PDCA is both fundamental and integral at every step of the process. You really have to think about it in that manner. So, talk about that here briefly. We've got here P, D, C, and A. Now, let me be clear that in the original version of this was PDCA. So Edward Deming, father of quality management, was really the first one to codify this. And he didn't call it check. He called it study. And that should really give some emphasis for you guys on how important this is. The initial version did not include checking your process. It included studying your process. But we identify a plan, which, let's be honest, can be a whole process in itself. We perform the work. We do the work. We check the work. But what do we check the work against? Oh, we check it against measures we previously defined in our planning process. Then we take actions. And you might not realize it, but you take actions all the time. Your action may be leave as is, accept it, reject it, scrap it. Who knows? But you're always making actions. So we go to action. If the action then is to move to the next process, well, we have a whole other process with its own PDCA cycle over here. On the other hand, we reject it and decide to rework, we can start over. So this is a cycle. Now, I want to make sure that it is understood that this is a cycle and is very much an iterative cycle. Let's see here. I have misplaced my clicker. Here we go. So when we're talking about this, we need to make sure that we understand the real value that consistency is in meeting these various requirements. We need to understand that each process really needs to be addressed in terms of its added value to the organization. So when you're going through, this is part of why the PDCA cycle and process mapping is very valuable, because as you're going through this, you have to ask yourself continually, why does it matter? Why does it matter? How does this have an impact anywhere else in the organization? And inevitably, if you cannot answer that question, you may want to consider removing that as part of your process. We've always done it this way. This is what we do. Those are great examples of waste that you can immediately cut from your process, saving you time and energy so you can focus on what matters most to your business, what matters most to your family, and do work that matters. So the last piece here is that improvement of processes is based on data and information. So the ISO standard has what it calls its core quality management principles, right? In the 2008 edition, they had 8 principles. 2015 edition, they have 7. It's roughly the same idea. Again, this is something else we've done at length in our podcast. But one of these principles is factual-based decision-making, evidence-based decision-making. So if you say, I don't think we need to do this, I don't think we need to worry about that, that's not enough. It should be, we have analyzed all of these interconnected and interrelated processes, and we can say with confidence, this is a waste. Or we can say with confidence that this is critical, because if we don't address it at this stage in the process, it will not get addressed later. So mapping multiple processes side by side is a great practice. Anyone that's ever worked with me, you'll understand just how much I love the chart paper here. It is a weekly occurrence that our office here is absolutely filled with chart paper and mapping one process and interactions to another. Very, very critical things to consider. So, yes, a little bit of a reiteration here of the plan, do, check, act model. But when you begin with the plan, You want to define your desired outcomes. Very, very, if not the single most critical part of your planning process, is define your desired outcomes. I'll say it again. You want to define your desired outcomes. Any of the process procedures that you might find available on the Texas Quality Assurance website, which if you're looking for some free samples, great place to go, absolutely free. You'll see the very first part of all of our process procedures is identifying the purpose, and then we identify the scope. If you do not know the purpose of the process and the intended results you plan to achieve, you're wasting your time. So this has to be where we start. What do we want to get out of it? Now, in the example here I used earlier, if we have a problem in the act phase, well, what are we going to check it against? We're going to check that act phase against the requirements we identified ahead of time in our planning process. Common terms for these are goals, metrics, KPIs, intended results, intended outcomes, customer requirements. All of these pieces feed into that PDCA cycle. So once you've identified this process, you want to start identifying your process procedures and process work instructions. And I use the word process here, not just because it's one of my favorite words, but because it is very critical to understanding what we're doing here. We're not simply writing an instruction on how to do something. A great example of a straightforward work instruction or a straightforward procedure would be lockout tagout. So if you're in the health and safety world, you know that with lockout tagout, any device that can be locked out, you have to have a written procedure of exactly how to do that. So the lockout tagout procedure applies to one location for one purpose, one function only. We don't really care about the process. When we're doing lockout tagout, we're not really caring that much about all the interconnected processes. What purchasing has to do doesn't matter to us. What engineering has to do doesn't matter to us. All that matters to me right now is that I lock out this equipment so I don't electrocute myself. That's it. That's all that matters. So that's a great example of just a work instruction. But on the other hand, if we're talking about a process procedure and process work instruction, well, now we can dig a little deeper. So here we would have a process procedure for identifying these hazardous energy sources. We would have a process procedure for how to write the individual lockout tagout instructions. We would have a process work instruction that would identify all of the various requirements for that lockout tagout procedure and how we might go about getting that deployed into the shop environment. So it takes it from a different aspect. So when we say process, know that there is weight added to that word, and it has very specific meaning, and it ties specifically to the planning of our PDCA cycle. So when we get into the do stage, this is the work you do. This is where those work instructions come into play. This is where your job travelers come into play. This is where your inspection documents come into play. This is where all of the various meetings and functions that we have really come into play. And this is the work you do. Now, depending on what you do, we could talk about this for hours, but we'll just kind of leave it there. Then we're going to move into the check phase. Your checks should be predefined. Now, does that mean that every time you check everything, it's because you were told to do it ahead of time? Absolutely not. No telling how many times I've walked out into the shop environment and just did what I call walk and talk. And we're just walk around, talk to people the whole time. I'm checking things. Ask them about this, ask them about that. Well, how'd that go? Why are you doing this? What's this over here? Those are part of your checking process. But I do have certain outputs that I'm expecting to find. Other examples of check could be regular inspections. So you may have a regular inspection pre-planned in this production process, also a part of the check. But we know that we're checking it against a predefined source. So in my walk and talks and QMS walkthroughs, I'm checking these against the existing process procedures and against the existing documentation that we have, against the existing processes that we have. Whereas on the other hand, if we're doing a inspection on the production line, well, we're checking that against the predefined acceptance criteria. We're checking that against the customer requirements. We're checking that against any number of other predefined criteria. And predefined being a very clear and critical term here. The last phase, which we talked about already, is the act. What are we going to do about it? So, God willing, the majority of the acts that you take are to accept and move on to the next process. Move it on to shipping, invoice it, move on. Those are the typical acts we want. Unfortunately, we know sometimes those acts revolve rework, additional training, instruction, scrap, leave as is. And let's just note that this wasn't quite in alignment. And all of that data can be very, very valuable for generating corrective actions, preventative actions, and so forth later on down the road. And we're going to have a number of videos to discuss those in detail. So put this graphic in here more because, well, to me, this actually makes sense. And this one right here is what you're going to find in the ISO standard. It's effectively the same information, just presented a little bit differently, but we'll walk through it real quick because this is the standard graphic according to ISO 9001. And since it's according to ISO 9001, that means that pretty much the whole rest of the world and every other compliance requirement that's out adopts the format in one way or another. Like it or not, the ISO sets the bar for future and all other current quality management or other management system standards. But it's essentially the same idea here is we have the same PDCA cycle, but we've got a variety of inputs. And so that's what we're looking at here really is what are the variety of inputs that we have in place. So we begin with what? Leadership at the center, leadership at the core. Now, leadership is a very different term than management. So management implies organizational hierarchy and structure. Leadership implies more a cultural idea. So when you think about ISO 9001, you do not immediately think, oh, this is telling me the culture of our organization. This is telling me how to guide the culture of our management system. It's not what comes to mind. It should be. If you actually read the quality management principles that the entirety of the standard is in alignment with, you very, very quickly see that leadership and culture are critical to a successful implementation of a management system and for an effective organization. So leadership's at the core. And branching off of it, we have support and operational procedures. The 7 and 8 there identifies as Clause 7 and Clause 8 of the ISO 9001 standard. We have performance evaluation, Clause 9. So when we talk about non-conformance reports and deviation reports and return material authorization, this is all Clause 9 activities. These are still honestly kind of a part of that check process, branching immediately off of the do. Then we move into improvement, Clause 10. Your corrective actions, your preventative actions, these are a Clause 10 function. Being a Clause 10 function means that they're all about continued improvement. So this is where the act phase comes into play, or the final acceptance. And then we move back into planning. So it's the same idea, though we see the idea of some of our inputs and some of our outputs. I am not a fan of this diagram, but you do need to understand it because it is what the world uses. I'm going to show you a better way here in just a few minutes. So what we want to do is really dig into this idea of integrative thinking. So integrative thinking, this is a term that we have used around here for a long time. Texas Quality Assurance is all about this integrative process approach. So the idea of integrative thinking is it's the ability to constructively, this textbook definition here, the ability to constructively face the tensions of opposing models instead of choosing one at the expense of the other, generating a creative resolution of the tension in the form of a new model that contains elements of the individual models, but superior to each. So let's think about an example here. What this means is that we have a problem and we've got two opposing sides. How are we going to approach solving this problem? Well, you could say solution A is better or solution B is better, but we know that both solutions present some unintended consequences that we're not very happy about. We don't really like the unintended consequences of either solution, and perhaps neither solves our critical issue well. That's the idea of integrative thinking, is that we can observe all of the requirements, the inputs and the outputs of both solutions, and then focus on the requirements of the problem we need to solve. Can we take components of both solutions to create a new model, a new way to solve this problem? And I argue very strongly that most of the time the answer is yes. Now, without getting into politics and things and so forth, how often do we see on the news with two talking heads? One's arguing this manner, one's arguing that manner, and there's no progress being made. how oftentimes in your design review sessions or in your monthly management meetings, is it the same thing? I'm arguing this, he's arguing that. Who's right? Could be that neither one of you's right. Could be that both of you have a workable solution. But what can we do to create a more integrative approach? And this idea of integrative thinking is actually core to the process approach, because the process approach does not care about the method. It is method agnostic. The process approach identifies a goal, predefined criteria, expected outcomes, and how we're going to achieve it. What resources do we have available? What inputs do we have available? And how we're going to measure that we attain the goal. Everything else is up for grabs. We can decide all sorts of actions, integrations that happen in between. So again, when we talk about process mapping, very, very critical. Integrative thinking is a huge component to it. So there is actually a Harvard Business Review on Audible, if you'd like to find about integrative thinking. Pretty short, condensed synopsis, but would be worthwhile of going and checking out. So if we're going to take this integrative thinking and incorporate it into the process approach model, we get an integrative process approach. See, we're very creative with our names over here. Building an effective QMS. Again, keep in mind the Q is quality in quotes, a quality management system, includes a consideration of numerous variables. These can be interested parties. Hey, that's a buzzword from the standard. Our customers, customer requirements, employees, their needs, what our competitors are doing. That's something to consider. What are our capabilities? We need to know what we can do and what we can't do. We have limits. What are our cost structures associated? Where's the industry going? I'm going to venture that half the folks that watch this probably in the oil and gas or energy industry right now. And that's a question we're all asking ourselves right now. Where is this industry going? And how's that going to impact what we do today, what we do tomorrow, and those strategic plans we need to make? What about the regulatory environment? What new regulations are coming down the pipe that are going to impact us? It's kind of tied up with the idea of interested parties and legal requirements still. And you have to consider all of these. And it's not so difficult as it sounds, I swear. But these variables must be integrated into a cohesive solution. So when approaching a problem from the mindset of an integrated process approach, well, I don't really care what my idea is. I don't really care what your idea is. I don't really care what the two ways that we've always done this are, because I'm going to solve the problem. And these are all valuable inputs to solve our problem and to identify a new process. So this is a much better version of the slide that we looked at before. I swear all of the same components are here. We utilize this approach on a very regular basis here with Texas Quality Assurance. The truth is, we do not enter into a project for consultation, long-term support, or a customized software development without first going through and defining all of our various processes. These processes are just absolutely critical to moving forward. So what we do is we first identify what are our resources, what are our inputs. Okay, that's important. What's our goals and our objectives? What can we do here? Where do we want to go? Then we're going to identify, well, what's the expected output? See how the bottom left hand and the top right hand of the sheet match. And it's with purpose. We are going to be on the upward trajectory to solve this problem. So our goals and objectives have to match with our expected outcomes. And our goals and objectives are going to be the useful tools necessary for performing those valuable checks and measures on the process. And we want to identify those resources and inputs. Very, just absolutely critical. And some of those inputs are also your requirements. So what legal requirements exist? Well, I'll tell you something here. We talked about this on a podcast we recorded this morning. It'll probably be released sometime soon. It's right here. I keep just kind of for sentimental sake. Now, some of y'all are probably laughing at me, Kyle. You're keeping a giant OSHA binder for sentimental sake. And yes, I do. So in this binder, you will find every CFR that was pertinent to the organization I worked at the time. And every single one of these CFRs has, on some pages, almost the entire page highlighted. My own personal notes, all the Post-it tabs and everything. But this was my first attempt at identifying the requirements. What are my necessary inputs? What are my limits, my restrictions, my legal requirements for developing a health and safety management system? Very, very critical to do. So once we have that, then we will move forward to identifying, well, what checks and measures are we going to have? So let's jump outside the quality umbrella for a minute. We'll talk about health and safety. So I was, for a while, the designated forklift trainer, powered industrial trucks. And God only knows how many forklift trainings I conducted. But we would annually audit the forklift program. We would, on a regular basis, conduct trainings. In each of those trainings, I had to not only have a classroom style training, we had a 4-hour-long training that we would conduct. Then we had to have a quiz that they would take to verify they actually learned some of the material. Then we would have them go through and actually perform a practical exam. And this was actually a lot of fun because what we would do, because everyone had been through the forklift training program already, so any newcomers, I would not set up the obstacle course for them. Instead, I handed over a list of requirements to the department supervisor, and he and whoever was excited to set up the new fun obstacle course would set up that obstacle course for the new employee. And there were basic features in here, such as lift a load that, is of minimum size and dimension, lift a load up to a certain height. Then they had to make so many corners with such tight radiuses. And so I could hand over that checklist to the department supervisor. And with an hour's time and, lots of fun and interaction from the team, they would set up a very interesting obstacle course for the new employee to go through. And it met all of the criteria necessary. That's part of the check. I know that when they go through that checklist, that they have ensured that the obstacle course is set up so that we can adequately test their practical driving skills. Now, then we would move into an act phase. Either they pass the obstacle course perfectly with no issues within the time allotted, or they didn't. If they did, they got their forklift card. If they didn't, they would go through a forklift driving education program with myself, and we would have fun driving the forklift around for a few hours over the next couple of weeks. But this is a simple example. Now, to do that, though, I had to go to the OSHA CFRs, and I had to identify, well, what are all the rules for operating a forklift program? I had to identify, well, what type forklifts do we even have at this organization? Do we have multiple types of forklifts? Do they get certified for one and not for the other? And you might think, oh, well, that's kind of silly, but yeah, I don't know. There's some forklifts, powered industrial trucks that are larger than this office, and a motorized pallet jack, believe it or not, still counts as a powered industrial truck. So you have to know the class that you're working with and where these folks are going to be operating in it. Are they allowed to operate in hazardous environments? So lots of things to consider. But it was made easy because I had a process map already developed that identified all of these limits and all of these requirements. So anytime something new would come up, perhaps there was an update to the OSHA CFR, perhaps we were looking to purchase a new forklift or institute a new maintenance program, I had my process map that I could always readily reference and had all the critical information I needed on it to continue and move forward. So it absolutely just cannot overemphasize the importance of this. So let's take an example here. All right. So here is what we will do. Let's see if I can keep the mic in check here while we go through this process. So in the other example I have here on YouTube is what we call the coffee pot process mapping. Coffee pot process mapping was, again, just kind of a fun exercise that we did. And we'll walk through something different here, but it was the most silly and absurd example of a process map session that I could come up with. And it was because when I was first tossed into, and I say tossed because that's about the most accurate way to describe it. When I was first tossed into the world of quality and health and safety management, I was told that we need to identify all of our existing SOPs. And we need to document everything. And I was instructed to begin with the office procedures because that would be simplest since I was the network administrator and clearly familiar with the office environment. And the first procedure that we picked was making coffee because coffee matters and is very critical to any office organization, I assure you. So let's take a look here. We'll use the power industrial trucks example. So for power industrial trucks, we want to identify our resources and inputs. We have resources and inputs here. So we have our CFR. Now, for those you don't know, CFR is your Code of Federal Regulations. So all that means is it is the rules that the federal government has issued. OSHA. In this case, it was CFR 1910 because we were general industry. But you need to know what your requirements are. Depending on where you're at, you may have state and local requirements to tack onto here as well. So we need to make sure to note those. Then you also have your current operating environment. So we've got our operating environment to be concerned with here as well. And what this means is maybe you've got ramps and docks that you have to worry about. Well, loading onto a dock, loading onto a ramp are two very different things. Maybe you're loading things onto the bed of a flat trailer. Maybe you're loading it to a cargo trailer. All very, very key requirements to keep in mind as you're developing this program. There's no need to develop a program for situations that simply do not occur. So then we've got our operating environment. We've got our trucks. Then we have our employees. Employees are very critical as well. You know, depending again on where you're at, maybe you've never had forklifts in your organization. You're getting them for the first time. And you're very excited about this because now you're working on newer, larger equipment. You can ship things in larger containers than you might have before. You know, you can pack and unpack much more readily. You don't have to worry so much about, who's delivering the goods to be able to unload everything. Lots of reasons that if you're getting forklifts for the first time in your organization, this is a great thing for you. Well, if you're getting a power industrial truck in your organization for the first time, I'm going to bet money that you don't have many people there who have any experience for it. So another requirement that we're going to have is a very good training program for that. So then we're going to identify what are our goals and objectives. Now, what I have on the PowerPoint over here that you can see is I note it as our vision of good. If you start identifying your goals and objectives by identifying KPIs, you're going to have a hard time. It's going to be a very long, frustrating, and not very fun process for you. And we want this to be fun. I actually do. I love doing this. I literally do it for fun. I know I probably need some help there, but hey, I enjoy it. So what's our vision of good? So what would you say is a vision of good with your power industrial truck program? Well, I would argue 0 accidents, 0 injuries is a vision of good. And hey, what do you know? That could be a very good KPI. But we don't want to start with KPIs in mind. We want to start with a vision of good. A vision of good would be, well, we're saving time and effort over other ways of doing this. So if you're not saving time and effort, you're wasting time and effort. And no one wants to waste time and effort. So how could we use this to save time and effort? Okay, well, in the forklift example, that was one of the requirements for my driving test is they had a time limit to do this in. A forklift driver that takes longer moving it with the forks than someone else could with a dolly is not helpful. So we want to identify some efficiency requirements there. So we want to save time and energy. We want 0 accidents, 0 injuries. You know what else? Probably need to make sure those things are maintained because I don't want this to be a drain on the cost for our organization. So I want to make sure that we've got a maintenance program there as well. So now we've got a number of things here. So what are our outputs? So we'll draw our third box over here. What are our outputs? An output here could be 0, say, incidents. We want 0 incidents. That's a good expected output. We want improved efficiency. That's a very good one. Okay. And we want to reduce cost. Well, that's going to require a maintenance program. Plus, maintenance program is required by the CFR after all, but just something else to consider. So these are our expected outputs. All right. Well, how are we going to check these? How are we going to measure these? It's another great question. So you can almost always, by default, put your internal audit as one of your checks and measures. The internal audit is just a great place to check for this information. But in addition to the internal audit, we could have our training program as a check as well. And I utilize this pretty heavily with our power industrial truck program. So every time that we would do a forklift training, the very first thing that someone would do before they took their forklift driving test is they would themselves perform a maintenance inspection, a pre-operational check on the system. And so this included checking the oil, checking the tires, checking the lights, checking the chains, checking the lube, checking the mass, checking all sorts of things to be checked. And we wanted to make this a very, very simple, easy process. So what I actually did is we took that checklist and made it into a laminated sticker. And we had to find the right type of laminating material, but it's out there. And you get laminated stickers that you put on that forklift. And we would then have the employees go through and perform a daily check. So whoever the first person was to drive the forklift for the day, perform the check. We kept a Sharpie there with it on a chain. They would note their name on it, snap a picture, and roll on. And that was just the daily process. And that ensured a lot of regular checks. And that check was an amazing check because it ensured that these things were always up to date with the latest and greatest maintenance. We had an annual preventative maintenance program in place where we would have someone come out that has the skills and expertise to properly maintain them, to replace the tires and so forth as necessary. And one of the checks on their daily inspection checklist was, has it been, more than a year since the annual inspection? And actually what we said is, is it within 30 days of the annual inspection? And if the answer was every yes, they were instructed to let the shipping receiving supervisor know and move forward. So it was a very, very good check that enabled us to meet a lot of these goals, from our CFR requirements to our employee training requirements. Really did a lot. So a good check that's well thought out can save a lot of time and effort. Now, we've not actually talked much about what we do with the forklift. And it's because the do phase of this is, from a process standpoint, not always the most important. What do we need? What are our goals? What are our requirements? What's our vision of good? What are our limits? What are our restrictions? You can't do much about that. They are what they are. You need to identify them. And how are we going to check to make sure we got those? Everything else kind of fits in here in the middle in our process and our controls. So the process here is that we had a forklift in each one of the shops. We had a forklift in shipping and receiving. We had the schedules in place for preventative maintenance. We had the schedules in place for the training program. This is the process. The controls then get down to the individual process procedures. And this is where actually developing a process map for every single process, not just an intellectual pursuit, but an actual map, is ideal, because then we could list, here is the procedure for our PIT program. Here is the procedure for our training. Here's the checklist and so on and so forth. And you can then know all of the required features that are necessary, all of the controls that are necessary to run a smooth, efficient process that meets your legal requirements, matches with your operating environment, meets your employee requirements, gets you that vision of good, so that you can come over here with 0 incidents, improved efficiency, reduced cost, all of the documents that you need to reference in a snap. So we strongly advise to keep process maps for every process. Now, one last bit of advice before we move on from process mapping is, I do not advise you to consider these documents as controlled documents. The reason being, is these are you as the quality manager, as the department supervisor, as the small business owner. These are your personal guides to developing the control documentation, to developing the KPIs, to developing everything else. These should be evergreen documents that you can review, edit, and access as a tool for better understanding to move forward. Because as soon as these become controlled documents, it adds a layer of complexity to the annual audit process that adds no benefit. Which brings us to one of the very first points that I started this talk on, is as you're developing a process, if adding this as a required piece does not add input, valuable input, does not have value added, then don't require it. So this is a part of how we develop these processes, but I would not make it an explicit requirement for documentation just because you don't want your auditor coming here and saying, well, I see that you developed an extra work instruction, but you did not go back and update that on your process map. Even though it's in your documented control information system, it has an approval on it and it has several revisions. It's just your internal tool. But this might be the most important internal tool you have when it comes to developing a process. And I said last, this will be the last point here, is let's go back to the initial example of what if we have two managers with very different opinions on how to solve a problem. Well, we could butt heads about it and argue and cuss and discuss for days on end, or we could go straight to the board and say, what are our requirements? What are our resources? What are our limits? Then we could say, what's our vision of good? If we can get it in alignment on that vision of good, we're going to have a good day. What's our expected output? How are we going to check that we've met these requirements and achieved our goals? Once those are defined, the process to get there almost doesn't matter so long as it gets you there. And this goes a long ways to reducing tensions. And it's not that the past 12 months has been, stressful and difficult with people working from home and in weird working environments and decreased revenues and higher goals. And, it's not like the last 12 months have been anything stressful that might induce disagreement. But if the last 12 months has been perhaps a bit more stressful than before, this is a fantastic tool for you and your team to solve problems effectively, utilizing not just a process approach, but an integrative process approach. So if you have any questions, if you have any comments, you have anything you want to add, please add it to the comments. If you are live on here, we should be able to get some comments pulled up in it. So let me know anything that you might have that you want to add, any questions that you have. I'll be more than happy to reach out to you personally, do the best I can to answer those questions. Of course, if you're looking to make some improvements in your organization, we can do a custom course just for you and your team for the time allotted. We've always broken our boot camp into 4 separate training days and can still do that for you. Also, if you're looking to make some improvements, or perhaps you're short-staffed right now, we have processes in place to allow for monthly support through our fractional management programming, consultation, internal auditing, software development, and training. So really, regardless where you're at in the quality management system and the process of implementing, maintaining, integrating, and improving, we want to be here for you and help you in every way we can. So with that, we'll go ahead and close out the broadcast here. Again, for anything additional you need, be sure to comment below or check us out at texasqualityassurance.com.